Good afternoon, Whoppers. The Chisholms are here to help you out with the Unit 1 packet for AP World. We want to just kind of go ahead and get into this, so it won't be too long for this video. I know the last one was 57 minutes, so just under an hour. We're going to try to keep it a little bit shorter this time. The first page of the packet is actually a timeline. It just kind of runs down the historical events, dates you need to know, and just kind of locations that we're going to be talking about throughout the packet. We'll go through and break down each step to what you need to have filled in for your packet.
All right, so the first key concept, which is like the big chunk of information you need to know, is about the expansion and intensification of communication and exchange networks. So we left off with, in the Unit 0 packet, talking a little bit about the trade networks, like the Mediterranean Sea, the Silk Road, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, and the Indian Ocean. So on the second page, it gives you a chart, and it says to identify the trade route based on the trading cities that developed. So the first option, it has Baghdad and Novgorod. Those were both trading cities along the Silk Road. The second one is Venice. Venice was a major trading city on the Mediterranean Sea. Timbuktu and the Swahili city-states, those were major trading cities along the Trans-Saharan network. And then Hangzhou, Calicut, Malacca, those are all in the Indian Ocean trade network. Mm-hmm. And then off to the side, it asks you a question. It says, why did these trade routes promote the growth of these cities? And so the answer to that is just that those merchants would congregate in those urban areas, those large population centers, to sell products, because of the fact that if you have one marketplace, then that's going to be an easy place for congregation. That's going to be an easy place to sell things, to sell goods. And that's going to draw people in and encourage the growth of services. So it kind of is like a chicken-egg situation where the merchants went to the cities originally to sell product, but also because the merchants were there, the cities grew. All right, letter B on page 2 says communication and exchange networks developed in the Americas, such as the Mississippi River Valley, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. And then it asks you, what empire did the Andes network facilitate? The answer to that is the Inca. Letter C, it says the growth of trade in luxury goods was encouraged by significant innovations in transportation and new forms of credit and monetization. And then it gives you a chart and it asks you to list the origin of some of the main luxury goods from this period. So silk is going to be a luxury good that originated in China. They discovered silkworms, and they were the ones that kind of patented, almost in a way, the creation of silk. Porcelain is another Chinese good. As you know, some people refer to porcelain as China because it originated in China. Slaves, that one's a little complicated, but just know that for this time period, slaves were primarily transported along the Trans-Saharan network. So you could just put Africa, or more specifically one of the African kingdoms, because they would oftentimes take prisoners of war and sell them as slaves. Of course, that's not specific to Africa, because that had been going on, in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, that had been going on for a long time. But during this time period, most of the slaves that were actually traded are going to be in Africa along the Trans-Saharan. Spices are going to be primarily derived from India. That is where you have things like pepper, for instance, which is going to be a primary spice used. And then exotic animals. Exotic animals is another one that's kind of tricky because you have exotic animals in a lot of places. Exotic animals were primarily traded in the Indian Ocean. And so you have several from Africa, as well as India and Southeast Asia. Things like tigers. At the bottom of page 2, it just asks you a question about why would the introduction of credit, paper money, checks, and banking houses increase trade? This is kind of common sense, but if you give consumers more options for how to pay for things, then they're going to buy more things. And it's going to alleviate the barriers that are associated with only having like one form of currency.
Okay, the next section, it says fill in the grids below about the significant innovations in transportation. We kind of already talked about this with Unit 0, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over this. But the first one, it says to identify, and you can see the image over there on the right-hand side. It is the astrolabe. How did this improve trade? It allowed merchants to know their approximate location using stars, which made getting to their destination easier and faster. Okay, our next image, we have a caravanserai, and if you remember, these developed along the Trans-Saharan trade route as kind of like a stopping point along the journey to refuel and to kind of trade as well. How did this improve trade? It gave merchants a place to stay, eat, and meet other merchants. So think of it, if you're going down the interstate and you are a truck driver and you're going to stop off at a rest stop. It's similar to that kind of concept of being able to eat, sleep, and meet other people in the same profession. The next image we have is our compass there on the right. How did this improve trade? Well, this is going to improve navigation by letting travelers know which direction they're going so they can plot it on a map. And then finally, we have our big ships, or the Chinese junks. You can see kind of the lateen sails there, and it allowed merchants to carry large items and in bulk. So it's going to make more money because you have more items to actually sell. It would also include the caravel as well.
All right, on page 4, it asks you to fill in another chart. It says, in the space below, explain how each of the following state practices facilitated commercial growth. So basically made them money. So the Inca road system is going to be a 25,000 mile long road system that's going to be built and completed along the western coast of South America. And they're going to build bridges and stairways. They're going to have like warehouses along the way and hotels along the way. And that's going to make travel easier and faster. Obviously, there's a lot of very difficult terrain along the western coast of South America. So actually building this road system is going to allow people to get from place to place very fast. And when you can get to place faster, then that means that you can trade faster and make more money. The next one is trade organizations such as the Hanseatic League. These are going to be organizations of merchants or guilds, which are like labor unions that are going to protect merchants in a particular skill or craft. And they're going to protect merchants from exploitation or piracy, things like that. And if you have protection for your merchants, then that's going to be able to make you more money.
And just like we talked about with the Mongols, the one thing that they're going to offer to the Silk Road trade is going to be that protection to allow the facilitation of trade.
All right, so next is going to be commercial infrastructure, such as the Grand Canal in China.
And what dynasty was that?
In the Sui.
How do you remember that?
In my class, we remember that the Chinese were swimming in the Grand Canal. So the Grand Canal is going to connect different areas of China, specifically the northern to the southern parts. It's going to connect the more urban sections of China to the more rural sections of China, the more agricultural areas, and that's going to make travel a lot faster. China has very diverse climates and landscapes, and so having one specific canal that's going to connect those areas is going to make trade a lot faster and more viable.
And that's going to be really important because during the Sui dynasty, they're regathering themselves and trying to reorganize after the Warring States period, after the collapse of the Han dynasty. So it's going to be necessary for them to get food from the more agricultural regions in China, and also send reinforcements to protect the northern border from nomadic invasions.
The last one is paper money and coin minting, and they already have that filled in for you, and we already kind of talked about that just a minute ago, so we're gonna skip. All right, so the next one is a map. Maps are hard for me to describe to you, so I'm gonna hold up my map. So basically, it's asking you about the geographic locations of empires. So your empires are China, the Sui Tang Song. Obviously, that's going to be in East Asia. The Byzantine Empire, which is going to be in kind of Eastern Europe, where like Greece and Turkey are. The Islamic Caliphates, which is really going to be most of North Africa and the Middle East. And the Mongol Empire is kind of unique because the Mongol Empire actually took over
a Chinese dynasty.
Right, it took over the Sui Tang Song, and they're going to take over the Islamic Caliphates. And so the Mongol section of your map is probably going to overlap with those two other empires.
Now, what are the names of the Mongol sections that are run in the Islamic Caliphates? What are they called?
The Khanates?
The Ilkhanates?
The Ilkhanates.
That's
yes.
right. Okay. So it gets a little confusing when the Mongols take over the Middle East because we have different names, but you have to understand that they are Mongols. So when it refers to the Ilkhanates, it's referring to those satellite states controlled by the Mongols.
All right, page 5. It says the movement of peoples caused environmental and linguistic effects. Then it asks you, it says the expansion and intensification of long-distance trade routes often depended on environmental knowledge and technological adaptations. Complete the chart below about these adaptations. So this is just looking at different groups of people and how they use the environment to improve their situation. So the Scandinavian Vikings, their adaptation would be the creation of longships. So what that allowed them to do was travel long distances very fast. Those are what you think of as like the typical Viking ships. They're very narrow, but they're also still very like sturdy. They are very vast, and so they're able to carry more goods as well. The Arabs and Berbers, those are going to be groups in North Africa that are going to use camels. So that's going to be their adaptation, is the use of camels. And what that's going to allow them to do is to travel through the desert. Obviously, because camels are going to be a beast of burden that is able to last several days without water. They're going to be able to form caravans, which is going to make trade more efficient. And that's going to allow them to participate in that vast trans-Saharan trade. And then the last group that the chart asks you to fill in is the Central Asian pastoral groups.
Clop, clop.
Knock, knock, or clop, clop. It's the people with the horses, and they made an empire, and then everyone else copied their horses.
Clop, clop.
This is the Central Asian pastoral groups. This is groups like the Xiongnu, the Mongols, and what they are going to adapt is the use of horses. And they are going to use horses to travel long distances in a very fast amount of time. They are going to use those horses for defense, and like we know with the Mongols, they basically lived on those horses, and so they're going to use the horses for everything. All right, as we move down page 5, it just tells you a little bit about migrations, and it's telling you about the effects of migrations, and it gives you a map where it already has marked the arrows of where things spread, and it's asking you to identify which one is the Bantu languages spreading and which one is the Turkic and Arabic languages spreading. And so if you look at the map, you have one section of arrows in sub-Saharan Africa. That's going to be the Bantu languages spreading through sub-Saharan Africa. And then if you look in kind of the Middle East and North Africa, that's going to be where you have Turkic and Arabic languages spreading.
And if you look at where like the Turkic people come from, that's going to make sense when you look at like the Mediterranean, right? That connection to modern day Turkey. Okay, so moving on to page 6, part 3, it says cross-cultural exchanges were fostered by the intensification of existing or the creation of new networks of trade and communication. In part A, it says complete the grid below to identify the key facets of the Islamic religion. So for the first part, it says theism, that is going to be mono. They believe in one God. The key God is Allah. And then the relative location would be Saudi Arabia. Remember, it's going to start in Mecca. Key figures or prophets, that would be Muhammad. And then the approximate founding would be 600 CE. The religious text associated with Islam would be the Quran and then the Hadiths. The Quran is supposed to be the direct spoken word of God, whereas the Hadiths are secondhand accounts or interpretations from other people. The moral philosophy here, it's very strict monotheism. There are 5 pillars to the faith. One is that there's only one God, so again, it's strictly monotheistic. 2 is that you have to pray towards Mecca 5 times per day. 3, you're going to have to fast during the month of Ramadan. Basically not eating until the nighttime hours. 4 is charity, basically giving to the poor. So this makes sense when we look at it in the context of Muhammad being a merchant, still wanting to have that wealth accumulation, but giving back to the poor at the same time is kind of the focus, not to be, a peasant and get rid of all of your wealth, but to actually gain wealth and give it back to the poor.
And to not be greedy.
And to not be greedy with that wealth, yeah, absolutely. And then 5 is the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. Basically, every Muslim needs to take this spiritual journey at some point throughout their life to travel to Mecca, to pay respects to that, sacred site. So the next part says, explain how the following religions influence the development of the Islamic faith. When we think about this on a timeline, it just kind of makes sense. With the oldest of the 3 faiths being Judaism, and kind of starting that trend of monotheism, the significant figures like Abraham and the foundations of the faith tie right into Islam because they are part of those Abrahamic religions. Christianity as well would kind of add on to what Judaism had already founded, with prophets like Jesus being concurrent throughout Islam and Christianity. There's themes of monotheism as well, and they share the same God. So basic principles are going to be the same, and just kind of ways to live your life and, kind of what's expected from the faith is going to be very similar.
Islam built upon the foundations that Judaism and Christianity had already kind of laid out.
Okay, so the next part says Islam spread through military expansion, merchants, trade systems, and missionaries. In the space below, identify 2 diasporic communities and explain how they introduced their culture into that of the indigenous peoples. So remember, diasporic communities are going to be those that don't really have a homeland, so people who are kind of minority populations throughout multiple countries. This one, you can kind of pick any diasporic communities, but we focused on 2, the Jews and Muslim merchants. Okay, so diasporic community number 1 would be Jews for us. Jewish communities in Egypt brought normalcy to monotheism, so they're going to, already have that sense of monotheism in North Africa. And our diasporic community number 2, Muslim merchants, are going to travel along the Indian Ocean trade route and bring Islam to Southeast Asia, and we can see that reflected in architecture. Part C says, as exchange networks intensified, an increased number of travelers within Afro-Eurasia wrote about their travels. The writings illustrate both the extent and the limitations of intercultural knowledge and understanding. So it says to complete the following chart in order to compare the travelers' experiences, basically. So we have Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo. So the first one, Ibn Battuta, it gives you a little bit of information there with travel dates, origin, and religion. And then you need to fill in the findings parts. So this is basically the information he gathered along his travels. So he wrote about how Islam was practiced throughout Dar al-Islam and kind of recorded the cultural differences. He's going to be shocked at the number of, for example, male family friends that women are going to have other than their husband. The way they dressed, the way they spoke, and kind of roles they played within society. So you're going to see that drastic difference between gender roles throughout Dar al-Islam. Because it is a very diverse area that we're looking at. Marco Polo, it's got some information there again on the origin, travel dates, and religion. And then some of his findings throughout his travels. He traveled to China and basically told of their imperial organization within the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty. Talked about their infrastructure and basically how Europe knew anything about China is going to be through the travels and documentation that Marco Polo provided. Part D, it's got a map for you, and it basically just says to illustrate each of those bullet points. It's pretty straightforward, just show the spread of Christianity throughout Europe, so you can kind of target in where Christianity is going to start in the Middle East, and then how it's spread throughout, Southeast Europe, and then eventually into Northern Europe. It's got the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia, of course, through trade. We already kind of talked about that through that Indian Ocean connection. Then we have the spread of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. That's going to be as the Islamic caliphates expand, and as trade increases in the Indian Ocean trade with Muslim merchants, it's going to start to expand to parts of Southern Africa and parts of Asia as well. And then the spread of printing and gunpowder from East Asia to the Islamic empires in Western Europe, again through that kind of trade route there from East Asia, from the Silk Roads, that connect all the way through the Middle East and then to Europe. Perfect. On page 8, we've got a couple of questions here at the beginning before we get into the next section. It says, what were some of the effects of the spread of printing? This is going to lead to books being printed faster and higher literacy rates because of the fact that the more books you have, more people have access to them, and the ability to read becomes more widespread. You also have more paper money that's going to be issued. So that's going to have an effect economically as well. Next, it says, what were some of the effects of the spread of gunpowder? That's going to lead to weapon development and the success of the Mongols and later gunpowder empires like the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. Okay, for this next section, I need a mask because this is going to be contagious. All right. There was continued diffusion of crops and disease like the bubonic plague throughout the Eastern Hemisphere along the trade routes. It gives you a list there of some crops that were spread during this time. And then it says, what was the negative effect of the spread of the plague? And for our answer, we have millions were dead, basically, and trade is going to suffer during this time because, obviously, the fewer people you have, the fewer merchants you're going to have. And then some positive benefits, and some may have not been seen as positive at the time. Obviously, you have millions dead, and a third of Europe is dead. But the positive effect here is it's going to lead to a rebirth of European society, and it's going to help stimulate the economy and lead to kind of workers being able to dictate not only their wages, but the jobs that they are willing to perform because there are so few people that are skilled in specific areas that are necessary for the society to continue. Okay, mask off now. Key concept 3.2, continuity and innovation of state forms and their interactions. It says here that empires collapsed and were reconstituted, and in some regions, new state forms emerged. So in the space below, it says to identify an Islamic state, Mongol Khanate, and decentralized form of feudalism that developed a new form of governance. So provide an explanation of what makes it unique. Down here, we just chose a few different ones. You can kind of put anything that fits into those categories. These are just suggestions of what we put. So the Islamic State, we put the Abbasid Caliphate. Of course, there's also the Umayyad Caliphate as well. The Abbasid Caliphate ruled through Islam. They're going to actually conquer territory throughout the Middle East and move their capital to Baghdad and focus on trade. This is also the caliphate that you're going to have the House of Wisdom develop as well. So not only focusing on trade, but on the cultural innovations of society as well. So the Mongol Khanate example we have is the Yuan Dynasty, Yuan, and it's basically the Mongols, but they adopted many Chinese practices, like a bureaucracy, but they're going to give more respect to merchants and women, and eliminate foot binding as a signal towards a more egalitarian society. Okay, so for decentralized feudalism, Europe or Japan, we put Europe. Of course, you could do Japan as well and have like the daimyo and samurais and things like that. But for Europe, we put the system that they had. At the top would be monarchs, and then you've got underneath the monarch the landlord. Underneath the landlords, you have the knights, and then of course underneath the knights you have the peasants. So they had a strict social hierarchy practiced on small-scale plots of land or fiefs that are basically going to dictate how societies run and drive that economic engine in Europe. Basically, many didn't communicate outside of their own fief. It's going to be really a kind of a small-scale society that's just isolated into their own respective communities.
All right, on page 9, it's asking you to look at some different civilizations that emerged in the Americas. So the first one is the Mayan, and they already have that one filled out for you, so I'm not going to go over that, but definitely make sure you review that information. The next one is the Mexica or the Aztec civilization. The Mexica is like the origins of the Aztecs, but the Aztecs built upon that and kind of evolved what the Mexica had started. So their relative location is in Mesoamerica, where Mexico is today. They approximately founded in about 1200. Their political and economic characteristics, things to remember, they did run from the city of Tenochtitlan. That was their capital. But they really had like a decentralized form of government where you actually had several smaller civilizations that lived in the area of the Aztec Empire, and they were allowed to do their own thing, but they had to pay tribute to the Aztec emperor. So one person at the top, and then all these smaller groups of people paid tribute to him in some way. So it would be gifts or money or labor or military service, but he kind of ruled indirectly through that tribute system. The religious system is polytheistic. They had a pantheon of gods. And they did practice human sacrifice. That's something to remember, and I'm sure that sticks out to you when you think about the Aztecs. That's what most people remember about them. Some of their technological innovations, they did have their own numeric system, which was pretty advanced. They were able to actually have a lot of the foundations of mathematics. Their weaponry was also very advanced. They used obsidian to make their weapons, which is like a volcanic rock, and you can get it very, very sharp. As far as artistic and scientific innovations, then you have the Aztec calendar. That was very important and very impressive. Anatomy and medicine is going to be pretty advanced in the Aztec Empire. They used a lot of medicinal kind of natural remedies using like plants. And anatomy, they had a very good understanding of the human body. A lot of the reason for that was because they did so much human sacrifice, and they had a process where they could actually take out a heart while it was still beating, because that was very important for the sacrifice itself. The heart had to still be beating. So you have to know a lot about the human body to disassemble it. And also chinampas, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but basically these floating gardens, this whole new way of agriculture that the Aztecs developed. The next page, page 10, it asks you to look at one more American civilization, and that is the Inca. Its location is going to be in the Andes, around where Peru is today, but it also extended kind of along the entire western South American coast. It was founded also approximately 1200. The political characteristics, it was a divine monarchy, so they believed their monarch to be a god, and that was important because they would do sacrifices to their monarch, and they would feel obligated to obey because they believed he was divine. It was really a federal system, kind of similar to the Aztecs, where it was split into different sections. And usually the monarch's relatives or close friends would rule the smaller sections, and then they would kind of report back to the one monarch in charge. Their religious system, it was also polytheistic. They had a pantheon of gods. They did believe in reincarnation, and that was very important in the Inca religion. There were, a lot of specifications for what you could and couldn't do in order to be reincarnated. And they also believed in human sacrifice to please the gods. Technological innovations, they did come up with their own system of measurement, which was very impressive. They actually used body parts for that system of measurement, similar to, like we say, a foot today. They had their own calendar system, and they knew a lot about medicine, kind of similar to the Aztecs. They used a lot of plants. Coca leaves were very important, and they figured out natural ways to combat illnesses. Artistic and scientific innovations, they did have quipu, which was their system of record keeping. They had a system of knotting chords to represent different letters and numbers. And that's also kind of an artistic innovation, because if you ever see a completed quipu, it's actually very, very impressive. They also had stone architecture that they were very proud of. It's really impressive when you look at something like Machu Picchu, for instance, which was one of their imperial courts. The architecture there is all stone. It's lasted for centuries, and they actually didn't use anything like cement or mortar. It's all just the stones are placed so perfectly together that it doesn't fall down. They also had the Inca road system we talked about earlier, where they actually built all kinds of roads and bridges all along the coast of South America to make trade easier. Mm-hmm. All right, the next chart that it asks you to fill out is for interregional conflicts and contact, and how those things led to technological and cultural transfers. So it gives you some of these conflicts and contact, and you're just asked to fill in the technological and cultural transfers that occurred. So the first one is conflict between Tang China and the Abbasids. So this is going to be where Tang China actually fought the Abbasids. It was called the Battle of Talas River, I believe. Mm-hmm. So basically what this did was it kind of exposed China. Like, China was so isolated for so long that a lot of people didn't even realize what China had to offer. And so whenever they fought the Abbasids, then it actually showed the Islamic Caliphates that, like, oh man, China actually has a lot of stuff. So things like gunpowder and paper making, that's going to be the first time that other people realized outside of China that China possessed that knowledge. The Mongol empires, obviously the Mongol empires are going to be a huge point of contact, because they are going to go all the way from Central Asia to East Asia to South Asia to the Middle East. And along the way, they're going to be spreading things. So they are going to spread gunpowder weaponry. They took that gunpowder that China had already possessed, and they're going to create things like the first cannons. And then they're also going to spread the use of horses along the Silk Road, and they're going to make the Silk Road a lot safer for trade, and that's going to spur a lot of cultural transfer between merchants. Next is the Crusades. So you already know the Crusades are those series of wars, the holy wars that are going to occur in the Middle East, over the course of like 400 years. And with the Crusades, you're going to have a lot of Europeans who had been so isolated because of feudalism, for the first time experiencing something outside of Europe. And so for Europe, the Crusades is going to be a huge turning point for recognizing things that are available outside of Europe. So in particular, spices are going to be introduced to these crusaders that are fighting. They're going to taste food for the first time with spices on it, and they are going to go crazy. And we know that that's going to lead to a lot of the exploration that's going to occur a little bit later in history. Is going to be because of the Crusades, and the Europeans were exposed to that for the first time. And then, of course, just other Middle Eastern and Asian goods that they're going to see while they're traveling. The last one it asks you to fill in is Chinese maritime activity led by the Ming Admiral Zhang He. So this is going to spread new innovations like larger shipbuilding techniques, because the Chinese are going to have these junks, which are these huge ships. And so other people are going to see those huge ships and they're going to say, hey, how can we make that? So that's going to spread. And they're also going to get all kinds of gifts from the tribute system, because remember, China is going to send out these sort of, exploration missions to gain tribute. So kind of like I was just talking about with the Aztec Empire, China would require these surrounding areas to give them presents. And so just an example of that is the champa rice that's going to be transferred from Vietnam to China in the tribute system. And that's going to be a drought-resistant rice that actually plays a crucial role in the future of China and being able to feed a large population.
All right, the next section says complete the following charts about technological innovations that significantly increased agricultural production. So our options are chinampas, waru waru, and terrace farming. So our first one, we can see this is basically these lake beds, the chinampas, that originated in Mexico. This is going to help improve agricultural production because it's going to be highly effective due to the fact that it has a constant irrigation flow from the lakes, and then of course the fertilizer from the fish in this kind of closed circuit.
Chinampas are also known as floating gardens.
All right, next so we have waru waru, and this is going to emerge in the Andean region. These are alternating canals with raised beds that are going to allow them to be irrigated properly and prevent freezing, which extended their growing season. Also, it's going to help prevent soil erosion. Next, we have terrace farming. You can kind of clearly see that on the hillside in picture 3. So terrace farming is going to be common in areas where you can find mountains or hills. They're going to cut steps into the land and basically prevent nutrient loss in soil. It's also going to prevent avalanches and landslides. So that's going to be important in these regions where you can see that there are a lot of mountains. Part B, what factors caused Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants to expand their production of textiles and porcelain for export? Basically, these items were in high demand and production methods improved over time. They're going to use this knowledge to produce more at a higher quality and capacity.
All right, on page 12, the next thing that it asks you to do is to fill out a chart there where it says Part A, and it says explain each of the forms of labor organization that occurred. So there are several different forms of labor organization. I'm just going to quickly go through these. Free peasant agriculture. This is going to be basically like feudalism. You are a farmer, you're a peasant, you're living in a rural community, but you're not tied to a landlord. You are free. You don't owe anybody anything. They're usually self-sufficient farmers that are in the countryside, and that can occur in any geographic location. Nomadic pastoralism, these are herders. These are people who herd livestock while moving place to place to allow their animals to graze. You see this a lot. It's very persistent in the Middle East, in Africa, especially in very arid regions. Craft production and guild organization. This is basically when artisans are going to work on one specific craft or trade. They're going to work in workshops, and oftentimes they would band together to form those guilds or like unions that we talked about before. And they're going to trade and sell their products. Coerced and unfree labor is the next one. And really just remember that the words coerced and unfree refer to forced labor. So that can really refer to slavery or debt peonage, any form of labor that is forced upon someone. So this could be any situation like taxes being paid in agricultural output, for instance. And the last one is military obligations. So this is seen in places like in the Inca Empire with the Mita system. They would require a certain amount of labor to the government in place of taxes. And oftentimes people would be able to pay their taxes by serving in the military for a certain amount of time. The next chart, it says for each of the civilizations listed, explain how, despite the persistence of patriarchy, women were able to exercise more power and influence than in previous periods. So basically, how did things get better for women? The first one is the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire was always a little bit less patriarchal because of the fact that they were nomadic and they had that kind of hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Mongol women were considered to be very crucial in Mongol society, and they could serve in the military. They could even serve as advisors to the Khan, the king. And they refused patriarchal traditions. So when you look at like the Mongols spreading into the Middle East, Mongol women would not wear the traditional face coverings. And when you look at the Mongols in China, women would not bind their feet. In West Africa, women were allowed to wear what they wanted. This is kind of whenever we're talking about with Ibn Battuta, this is something that he published in his findings, that women were allowed to have male friends, they were allowed to wear what they wanted, and we see a lot more freedom with women in Africa because of a lot of matriarchal traditions there. In Japan, women were able to become literate, which is a big improvement because in a lot of areas of the world, women were not even allowed to learn how to read and write. And you did see some of the Confucian restrictions lifted in Japan during this time period because previously, because they were part of that tribute system, they had adopted a lot of Chinese traditions, and a lot of that's going to start going away. Women could even be samurai in Japan. That was even allowed. In Southeast Asia, you have a lot more traditions in Southeast Asia, kind of like with Africa, where you do have some matriarchal societies. Places like Vietnam, for instance, were already a lot more accepting of women than other areas of the world. But some things that made it really unique is that women were able to be financially independent. Women could have their own jobs. They could work, on a farm. They could have their own trade or skill that they specialized in. And one kind of interesting tradition is that in Vietnam, men would typically move in with the wife's family whenever they would get married. The last page, page 13, it asks you to fill out a chart about the role of serfdom, and we've kind of already gone over this a few times, but I just want to clarify. European serfdom and Japanese serfdom are very similar. The process is pretty much the same. Serfdom, or feudalism, as we would call it, is a social and economic hierarchy that was established in which citizens are tied to a landlord. So you're either tied to the landlord by doing peasant work for them, like agriculture or domestic help, or you're tied to them by doing military service, which is like what we see with knights and samurai. And then the landlords were tied to the monarch. And so they would, pay taxes to the monarch on behalf of their citizens that they were in charge of. So in European serfdom, the hierarchy is going to look like the monarch on top, underneath would be the landlord, and then underneath the landlord would be the knights and the peasants. And in Japanese serfdom, it's basically the same system, they just have different names. So in Japanese feudalism, you'd have the shogun at the top, and then you have the daimyo, that's going to be the Japanese version of landlord, daimyo, D-A-I-M-Y-O. And then underneath that, you have the samurai and the peasants. The last one is the Incan mita system. I know I've mentioned this several times, but that's basically just compulsory work for the government that people were required to do. This is going to be in place of taxes, where you would actually give up a portion of time to work for the government in some capacity. It may be military service, it may be agricultural work, but you are going to be required to do that work for the government.
Yep.
All right, so at the bottom of that page, you have a list of key vocabulary. I just included that as things that you may want to look into if you're not familiar with. Several of those we've talked about in this video or the last video. Several of those were your vocabulary words from way back when we were in school. So you may just want to look over them and review what they mean, but that's not required. You don't have to define those separately or anything like that.
Okay, guys, we'll have the Unit 2 packet up next week. I hope you guys stay safe. If you have questions, let us know. We love you, and we'll see you soon.
I love you.
Can I pet that dog?
No.
Can I pet that dog?
No.
Can I pet that dog?
No, he's
Can I
sleeping.
pet that dog?
Can I pet that dog?
Can I pet that dog?
Can I pet that dog?